I mean, it's a shocker. But you can't control it, you can only just about manage it. And the only way of managing a border like that is to respond to the deep, deep, deep macro socio-economic failure across the minorities that live on those borders, the Tuareg and the Tibu, who are transnational communities that are both Libyan in one breath, but are also from Niger, or from Mali, or from Chad, or from Burkina Faso as well. Now, unless you understand the shifts and the way in which those communities work, then there's no way that you can securitize a border. In fact, by talking about control, you're probably only going to further marginalize them. By talking about trying to further clamp down on criminal networks and terrorist networks, you're only going to further dampen their ability to survive economically. Now, unless you tamper to the real cause and the real root causes of these communities, which is bad economics, then you're only going to treat the symptoms in the long term, which is terrorism, crime, and so forth, and probably human trafficking, which is a lifeline for most of these communities. It is a lifeline. Niger, Mali, the same communities that are there, that are also in Libya, have also got to be spoken about in macro socio-economic terms, and not just thrown into the basket of terrorists and criminal networks. So, to be a failed state requires two things. First and foremost, it requires the will to be a failed state. It has to have actors on the ground that are actively trying to fail it. And in Libya, there is that. But it also requires neglect. And the neglect will come from the international community. And it comes from a misdiagnosis of what the issues are in Libya and also across the Arab world. But it also comes from just bad economic practice. So, there are some of my thoughts. Socially speaking, what is security? Security is about emancipation, it's about human security and emancipation. It's about the freedom to or the freedom from. But it's also about possession. It's about having an army. It's about having it's about having wealth in order to try and buy yourself out of, bad economic practices as well. So I suppose those two things, about the freedom from and the possession of, stand in complete distinction to the forces on the ground, social forces on the ground, in both Tunisia and Libya and in Egypt. And if a militiaman today holds a Kalashnikov, he holds it for a reason. He doesn't hold it because he wants to cause a threat to his brothers and sisters in Libya. He holds it because it's an economic or an insurance policy, if anything. Having a Kalashnikov in Libya guarantees you a salary. It guarantees you a form of autonomy. It guarantees you a voice in politics. Unless you respond to those issues and those causes, then you're only going to treat symptoms in the long term. I'll finish on a very simple point. Egypt is the most interesting of the dynamics in the Arab world. One, because in Egypt, as in Libya, as even in Tunisia, Arabs are, and this is a statement of regret. I suppose we're not averse to calling coups revolutions. We did it in 52 under Nasser. We did it in 69 in Libya under Gaddafi. We did it in 56, even arguably under Bourguiba, though I'm sure I'll upset some people by saying that. But we're not averse to calling it those things. The 20th of January was a coup. The 30th of June was a coup. The 15 most well-known political scientists, by their criteria, would call it a coup. Now, why are we substituting the ballot box for a street protest? And why are we actually allowing it to happen under the auspices of the EU, under the auspices of the international community, under the auspices of the West, namely America, for allowing those things? And in fact, under a lot of cases, because I spend about a third of my time in Brussels with some people that I see also here as well, and they all stand testimony to the fact that some European diplomats had been so skeptical about the Muslim Brotherhood and had said, well, they're just bad guys, and they never even gave them a chance. The Muslim Brotherhood is a victim today. I'm not afraid to say that. I don't mind being thrown into the camp of saying that I'm a Muslim Brotherhood apologist. I'd rather call myself a liberal because I know what a liberal value means, and I don't want to call myself somebody that sits on the fence of being a nationalist or sits on the fence of saying, well, they might take away our alcohol. Does that really matter when you've got people in squares across the country being trampled on and being murdered? There may be a polarization, and I heard the last speaker saying there may be a polarization in the Arab world between secularism and between Islamism. But let's speak about the reality. The reality is you had many people emerging from both the rule of Ben Ali, the rule of Mubarak, and the rule of Gaddafi, feeling disenfranchised, feeling marginalized, and having felt that their religious rights were just trampled on for over 40 years. Why can nobody safeguard those rights? And at the very same time, safeguard the rights of a small number, and they are a small number because what they accounted for in the elections in Egypt were somewhere around 6%. There is a small number, but a vocal minority, one that has to be safeguarded. But when we speak about a minority, how can they, in a matter of months, become 30 million on the streets? Well, it calls into question whether or not they were 30 million in the streets. You know, Tahrir Square holds around 250,000, or 500,000 at a very liberal estimate. Heliopolis around 211,000 by crowd density experts at a liberal estimate. So what are we really talking about? Are we talking about, you know, mass upheavals? Or are we talking about minorities? And here in the West, in Europe, being the theatre for, you know, all this, how would I call it, slogans and you know, and just trying to reimagine these springs that we had here in Europe, when in reality, they are very, very much overt to this spring. I'll leave you with one thought. And I suppose if you come away with one thing that I've said today, let it be this. Beware of the myth of the people. Do not speak about a people, you know, a people in the Arab street and the Arab people. They are no more, they're not in a consensus and they're not heterogeneous, no more than they are in Europe. There is plurality in Europe and there is also plurality in the Arab world. So if we speak about Arab shifts and Arab generalities, then we haven't really understood anything about the Arab Spring. Let's not speak about it in a linear fashion. Let's speak about it in pluralities. And I suppose, again, like I said, if you come away with one thing that I've said here today, let it be that. If we speak about the myth of the Arab people, and then we want to substitute ballot boxes for a street protest, then in fact, are we really talking about democratization? Are we really speaking about the very issue that we're here to speak about today, whether or not democratization and stability are even there? That's a false binary. That is not the binary that we're looking at today. We're talking about myths today. And I suppose the European Union and European community has a track record in building democracy. So why is it fervently and, you know, and unabashedly helping the destruction of democratic actors on the ground, those that I've witnessed over the last 18 months? Why are we not understanding that, in fact, in an era of fiscal austerity, you do not have the money to get the Arab world out of a fiscal crisis? They count, and ultimately it will count when the checks are signed and when money is delivered to the Arab world. They'll count those metrics in millions when the Arab world needs billions. So understand what you have as an asset. Your asset is a track record in democracy. It is not about, you know, about making it rain, so to speak, with lots of dollars and lots of euros. That is not the case for the Arab world, and it's not the case for the European Union. You have to stand behind plurality. You have to stand behind the rule of law. If anything, allowing what happened in Libya 2 weeks ago with the capture of Abu Anas al-Libi, the Al-Qaeda operative who, in fact, was sitting in a very, you know, quiet neighborhood in Libya doing nothing, and then is captured by Marines going against the sovereignty of the Libyan government. And it's not a case of not wanting to get, you know, an Al-Qaeda member. If many Libyans had known that there was an Al-Qaeda operative living there, they wouldn't have wanted them there in the first place. But in fact, you've weakened the government there. The European Union has been unilaterally acting. And I have to make that point very clear. There is a myth that the European Union acts, you know, in a unified, coherent sense. It acts unilaterally. The Italians, the Brits, the French, and the Germans act on their own national interests. They speak to militias on their own terms. They don't speak as a unified body. And I'll make that my... I'm sorry.
We are past the time, and I'm sure you will have the time to answer many questions. I'm sure there will be many to you. So I suggest we leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am sure there will be many opinions also about your statement, whether the 25th of January was a coup or a revolution. But coming from a country where we have protests for 140 days, I am going to pass the floor for somebody who comes from a country where they had also a very, very huge wave of protest. It seems that we don't believe that democracy is only about ballot boxes. It also needs some other depth to it, but maybe this is a different part of this conversation. Before I give the floor to Ahmet, one very short observation. There is an EDAM foreign policy poll that came out just yesterday, which is basically saying that the biggest risk to the Turkish broad audience seems still to be an independent Kurdish state. However, for the experts community, the biggest risk is the radical Islamization of the Middle East. Turkey was a very active participant in the events, so I'm sure you will tell us more about how you see it.
Thank you, Vessela. Thanks to the organizers for having me in such an important event with, as Anas has said, with a lot of brilliant and interesting minds around. I will try to keep my points as points so that I can enable some kind of a debate, hopefully, at the end of my speech. Listening to both speakers, I had this thought in mind, which kind of made me to think about it. The result of what I have all heard, what we have all heard, is that generalizations, in a sense, are what you reach when you have enough number of exceptions with adequate number of similarities. Now, this is the Arab Spring or the situation in Turkey as of today. We have some similarities because we can address the situations with similar concepts, but the contexts are totally different, but the risks happen to be the same. And I think that if there was any one common theme that could have been providing us with a title to this whole session, that could have been what Mrs. Ambassador has said at the start, which is euphoria versus disappointment. I think it is everywhere. Lord Acton once famously remarked that power corrupts and power corrupts absolutely. And I think this is part of the explanation of what is happening in Turkey right now. In a country with a deep social and political culture of authoritarian leanings, push for rights is a new phenomenon. That was the thing about the headscarf issue in Turkey. There were girls who were not let to be attended to school with their headscarves. Seculars saw that as a red line of theirs. And Islamists, the more pious crowds, thought that that was their obligation to God. What is more, it was defensible on the grounds of democracy, which made sense. And in the end, right now, even as we speak today, there are headscarfed parliamentarians that are entering to Turkish parliament, and there is still some debate going on. However, I would definitely like to underline the headscarf issue as one very good example of fights or push for rights in Turkey. Even though me, myself, am not, I cannot most probably be considered one of the most pious people living in Turkey. Nevertheless, it was a civil rights issue. I was teaching at the university. The times were different. We were instructed by the administrators of the universities to push the headscarfed girls out of the classrooms, which was pretty undemocratic. And that cost the secular establishment their power. That was a push for rights again. Now, what happens today in Turkey, what happened at the beginning of the summer in Turkey was again a push for rights. And most probably, the people, the government, which is in place right now, has lost the vision of what on philosophical and political legitimacy grounds made them so successful in their first, I would say, 5 years of government. That was their role as facilitators of the push for rights coming from the people. But today, the reading from the government is totally different. The government, again, the AKP government, has been very successful and instrumental in leveling the political playground in Turkey for the expression of the political will of the civilians. That was, again, one of the biggest sources of their success. But today, by means of the policies that they are pursuing, they are just trying to, they seem to be at least trying to head the ship to a totally different direction. That has its own dynamics, but I'm not going to get into detail of those dynamics themselves. But if there are questions, I would be more than happy to ask. But let me just say that we are at such a point that the political playground is leveled, checks and balances system is out, elitism is cursed, and I'm not suggesting that we should be elitists all around by that. And what we are left with is the intention of the people that rule. Because in the absence of checks and balances system, if you have true believers in democracy in place to govern your country, then the system itself will somehow, perhaps erroneously, but function democratically. But if the intention is not there, in the absence of the checks and balances system, you are really in trouble. There's a structural clash with roots deep in the political culture, as I said, which is authoritarian. When the seculars were dominating the landscape, that was still somehow authoritarian, and right now it is still the case. And there is also the other kind there's another kind of effect on the current processes, which is the practical toxication of political power, the exact thing that Lord Acton has referred. The increasing of votes, time and again, election after election, referenda after referenda, by the AKP government seems to toxicate their decision-making mechanisms and the will to exercise their own power. The majoritarian understanding of democracy is pitched very strongly against a pluralistic understanding of democracy. The concept of inclusiveness, understood from the perspective of educating people into yours, theirs, own school of thought, is the name of the game now. There are already tangible consequences of Gezi protests, though. So that is why I think that AKP government would be serving itself a favor and the country for sure a favor if it remembers all the points that I tried to make above. Because right now, after the Gezi protests, we have two sureties. A, no El Presidente. The change that Erdogan tried to impose in the Constitution of Turkey has been something that would have enabled him to exercise omnipotent powers. That is why I prefer to call it El Presidente. Many people in Turkey call it in different names. But that system is over. I mean, that dream is over. B, there will be no solution to the Kurdish issue on the basis of Erdogan's priorities. This also has to be understood as a means of the first. The policy should be understood as a means of the first. Now there is what I would tend to believe a much more healthy dynamic in place, bringing together activists and opening up avenues of building consensus within the society itself, especially in urban centers like Istanbul, Ankara. This is, of course, a very process at its infancy. We will have to see how it unfolds. But with this process in place, if this keeps on, this social dynamics, this political grassroots dynamic keeps on preserving its momentum, then we will most probably have a much more, we'll most probably have a better shot at resolving our Kurdish issue.
You have 3 more minutes.
Okay. The reaction from the government was arrogant, disdainful, polarizing, labeling the protesters vandals, marginals, looters. And then the Turks have presented another word into English language, which is çapulling. The Turkish version of the word loot is çapulcu. And what fed into the reaction was frustration, the binary worldview that feeds into Erdogan's aspirations of becoming the El Presidente, coupled with his reaction for the masses, or at least 50% of those masses, and for God's sake, we're talking about 50% of the population of a country, was not understanding his position as the missionary man. So there was the personal frustration at one level. The other level was calculative, because he felt that his real political designs were in danger, and they are gone now. The attitude had a base in old school Islamism's never again approach. This never again approach is something that deserves some explanation, but
not now.
Not now. And at some rate, political pressure from the constituency, which doesn't want to really lose its leverage in terms of its political and economic gains. A couple of words, perhaps, on foreign policy.
Yes, please.
Yeah. The foreign policy was carried out not on the basis of foreign policy for a long time, but primarily a tool for domestic transformation as a part of an omnibalancing act. Again, a theoretical concept I can explain. And as AKP's foreign relations rather than Turkey's foreign policy. That explains largely the reaction about Egypt, the reaction about Syria. That's the transboundary Islamic Brotherhood concept that is in action. AKP wants to position itself as a center of this whole political movement. And as such, it is carrying out movement-specific foreign policy roles. And those are, as I dub them, AKP's foreign relations rather than being Turkish foreign policy. And circles from Güleni community, which is a very important force in Turkey right now, started to voice that there are things that should have been learned from Kemalist foreign policy, which I really find amazing. And why did the whole foreign policy fail? Question can be addressed on 5 different grounds. Because, first of the hypothesis, which is that the West is in terminal decline. The West might be declining, but whether or not that decline is terminal is something